Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, When Theory Meets Theology, Examining Assumptions of Faith-Based and Faith-Placed Interventions. I'd like to thank you all on behalf of the African American Collaborative Obesity Research Network, ACORN, a national research organization based at Drexel University, and the Center for Diabetes Translation Research at Washington University in St. Louis, for your participation in this afternoon and interest in this topic. During the presentation today, we ask that you post questions using the Q&A button in the Zoom webinar interface. We will review and select questions for our speaker to respond to during the question and answer period at the conclusion of today's presentation. If your question is not selected for response, we will share follow-up feedback after today's session. Please feel free to use the chat window to interact with fellow attendees during the session this afternoon. This presentation will be recorded and archived for future viewing. We will publish the webinar online and share the link via email shortly afterwards. My name is Sheldon Oliver Watts, and I will manage today's webinar. I'm the National Director of ACORN. ACORN is a collaborative network of scholars and community-based research partners located in over 20 different states. Our national office is located at Drexel University's Dornsife School of Public Health in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and we are within the Department of Community Health and Prevention. ACORN leverages the credibility and perspectives of Black American researchers and research partners to facilitate more relevant, community-engaged, high-impact intervention research. I am also the core manager of the Solutions to Diabetes in Black Americans core at Washington University Center for Diabetes and Translation Research. As a disparities core, we provide methodological and content expertise to develop innovative approaches that advance the field of diabetes research in Black Americans. Today's presentation will illuminate and discuss assumptions associated with faith-oriented interventions that can be incommensurate with the theological and operational context of churches and other faith institutions. Faith settings are logical as a potential venue for lifestyle change interventions related to weight management and diabetes control in Black communities. Addressing these and other assumptions can lead to improvements in intervention effectiveness, uptake, and sustainability. This webinar will feature our respected speaker, Dr. Marino A. Bruce. Dr. Bruce is a Research Associate Professor of Medicine, Health, and Society, the Associate Director for the Center for Research on Men's Health, CRMH, and the Director of the Program on Faith and Health within CRMH at Vanderbilt University. Dr. Marino Bruce is a social and behavioral scientist with interest in the integration of the full range of health determinants, specifically for young African American males, and their risk factors for chronic kidney disease and cardiovascular disease. His current research explores the intersection of race, gender, spirituality, religiosity, and behavior, and their implications for social and health outcomes among African American male boys, adolescents, and emerging adults. He is also a certified rehabilitation counselor and an ordained Baptist minister, and leverages the strengths of research, community, and faith-based communities toward efforts to improve the health of disadvantaged and disenfranchised males, their families, and communities. I'd like to now offer a warm welcome and invite Dr. Bruce to begin our presentation today. Sure, Dr. Bruce will be beginning shortly.
There we are. I'd accidentally muted myself. Thank you again for this invitation, and thank you to ACORN and the Center for Diabetes Translation and Research Center in particular for this opportunity to present today. The acknowledgments that I have no disclosures, no conflicts of interest. I would like to note that this presentation contains elements from a manuscript that's in progress, so if there are some ideas you'd like to use in your work, please cite this presentation. And it's also important to note that the content in this presentation is the responsibility of me and me alone, and does not represent the views of Vanderbilt University, Washington University of St. Louis, Acorn, or even the Center for Research on Men's Health at Vanderbilt as well. Okay. With respect to the overview, I really try to keep things simple. We're going to talk about three things. The first part of this presentation will focus on assessing assumptions. The second part will focus on sacredness of the setting, which means that we'll be talking about faith-based institutions and churches in particular. And then we're going to talk, the last part of this presentation will focus on covenant-driven collaborations, and we'll conclude with an example that we're actually working on within the center. So assumptions are part of scholarly work. They're part of the empirical world, and it's important to note that value-free, which is an important part of the scientific method, does not necessarily mean assumption-free. Assumptions about the world that we have can shape our conceptual lenses. It can shape our interpretations. It can shape our interest. Assumptions are all around us. And so I was, in thinking about this presentation, I drew upon some of the training that I had and focused on the work of Max Weber. Weber was a social scientist during the Enlightenment period. He was also a philosopher. And so he spent some time thinking about how do we make observations about the world and share them with our colleagues. And it's important that this concept of Verstehen, and my German's a little rusty, it basically asks scientists to consider their observations, their values, their understanding of the world, and share it with their colleagues in scholarly communication, both orally and also in the written word. And through this work of reflecting and saying, okay, how is it that I'm thinking about this? Assumptions can become apparent through this reflection or interrogation. So with that, I thought it would be important for you to know a little bit about me and how I come at these issues. I'm a sociologist by training, but I also have degrees in divinity and rehabilitation counseling, and some of that was shared in the overview by Dr. Watts. But it's also important to note that I would classify myself as bivocational. I'm a research associate professor of medicine, health, and society, an associate director of a research center, and the director of a program of faith and health. But I'm also the minister of congregational care at my church. So for me, coming to this point, recognizing that I can serve as a bridge between the scientific and faith community, which took some time to come to this point, because early in my career, I thought I had to choose between a scientific career or one that's more ministry focused. And it has taken a number of years to come to the point to realize that actually I can do both. And so there are a few words on this last bullet that speak to my approach, how I view the world. Multi-level, contextual, cognitive, solution-focused approaches to reduce health disparities and achieve health equity. So that gives a sense of the worldview in my approach to things. And so things really became in the focus when I began to do some work with the Jackson Heart Kids Study, which is a pilot study of the children and grandchildren participants in the Jackson Heart Study, which is one of the largest observational studies of cardiovascular disease in this country. And we published a paper a couple of years ago that focuses on spirituality, religiosity, and weight management among African American males. And we thought it would be good to think about how adolescents, to collect data on adolescents, their views, their thoughts, and their activity with respect to religiosity to see if that had any impact on their weight-related behavior. And we found, and here are some descriptive statistics that will give you a sense of the sample of males that we analyzed. It's important to note that there were 212 kids in the study, and half of them were males, which we were very proud of that fact, and we have found by looking through the literature that that's a bit of an achievement. And so, without belaboring this point too long, one of the things we found is that as spirituality increased, and we used the daily spiritual experiences scale that was produced or created by Underwood and colleagues, which gives one the sense of their experience with experiencing God and seeing God in the world around them. As this score increased, the odds of young men in this study attempting to lose weight increased by 22%. We also found that as the spirituality score increased by 1, we found that their attempts to control their weight through diet increased by 13. The odds increased by 13% as well. So with that, it told me that something was there. And it's important to begin to do a deeper dive into how does religiosity, how does spirituality, or the way that I typically talk about it, how does faith impact health outcomes among African Americans in general and African American males in particular? So in reading some of the work that's been done, I thought about some of the assumptions that are there and thought about the importance of assumptions. It's important to note that assumptions can be guideposts in science because they guide theory construction. And this is an example. When we think about positivist theories, the assumptions that undergird them is that there's one way or one particular pathway to be explored, and we look for the most significant pathway, and that's what our attention is. But when we look at some of the assumptions behind relativist theories, there are multiple pathways. And so one pathway is not more important than the other. It's important to explore multiple pathways. So just those two perspectives can give one a sense of how they approach science and how they approach scientific observations. It's also important for this particular talk today is that assumptions can affect intervention development. There are assumptions about settings or locations. There are also assumptions about individual population or organizations. And it's really important to note that assumptions can be explicit, which we tend to give a little bit more attention to, but also assumptions can be implicit as well. So it's really important to think, when we think about the connection between faith and health, it's important to remember that the connection between these two areas have been of interest to scholars and the general public for centuries. Healthcare organizations of different types have been founded and supported by religious groups. The most obvious connection that we see between faith and health is actually the connection between healthcare and faith-oriented observations. However, the footprint of faith and health research is much less present, but it's been growing over the past 2 decades or so. And I want to take a moment to highlight, center our attention on some recent work by Dr. Christy Lancaster and colleagues. And Dr. Lancaster is an original member of the ACORN network, and her work focuses on interventions in faith-based settings. I'd also like to do a shameless plug, is that this article is part of an excellent supplement led by the ACORN group that was published in Obesity Reviews. So regardless of whether you're interested in faith-based interventions or other types of interventions, consult this supplement, and I'm sure that you will not be disappointed. I highly recommend it. But getting back to this article reported on the effectiveness of 27 interventions in faith-based organizations that focused on improving weight and related behaviors among African Americans. There were 12 randomized controlled clinical trials, 5 single group or quasi-experimental studies, and 10 pilot studies. There were 4 expectations that were noted in this work. One is that multi-level approaches would have greater impact on weight-related outcomes than single-level approaches. 2, the second expectation was that group interventions would have better outcomes than one-on-one or individual level approaches. The third expectation was that interventions led by lay health advisors would be beneficial as these groups would add, as the involvement of lay health advisors would add power to the intervention. And the fourth expectation was that faith-based interventions will be more effective than faith-placed interventions. There were some key findings of note in looking at this recent review of obesity interventions in African American faith-based organizations. The first is that around 66% of the 18 studies targeting weight reported reductions in weight, which says that these interventions were quite successful. And when we looked at the RCTs, we found that the successful adoption of lifestyle behaviors were reported in 7 out of 11 of them, so a little over 60%. With respect to the expectations, there were some interesting findings of note. First of all, multi-level interventions were not necessarily more efficacious than single-level interventions. The results regarding the impact of group versus individual level interventions were mixed. Some had findings showing that group level interventions were a little bit more efficacious, but at the same time, there were other studies that showed that individual level interventions were more efficacious than group level interventions. One particular finding of note that will require additional research would be that lay health advisor-led interventions were less likely to report weight loss than intervention without lay health advisors. And it's important to note here that this is where it's important that we have more precision, because there is not a gold standard of what a lay health advisor is, or the qualifications for one, or what have you. So it could be that the murkiness with respect to these studies with respect to lay health advisors could be related to the fact that there's tremendous variation among lay health advisors. And the fourth finding of note here is that differences between faith-based and faith-placed interventions were difficult to determine, because even those interventions that were faith-placed were found to contain elements that can be found in faith-based interventions. So it was difficult to distinguish between the two. So when we consider some of the findings that presented in the Lancaster et al. Paper, it actually raised some interesting questions about how we think about faith-based or faith-placed research, and what are some of the assumptions that are made. One is that when we consider faith-based organizations or faith among African Americans, we often treat them as if these groups are monolithic. And we find that typically we often think that African Americans are primarily Christian or exclusively Christian, because we typically find that most of the faith-based research are located in churches. However, we also should consider that there are African Americans of the Jewish faith, and also there are a number of African Americans who are of Islamic faith. So there's considerable diversity of faith within any given populations, but in particular African American populations. It's also important to note that there's considerable diversity within denominations. So I'm an ordained Baptist minister, so I thought that it would be important to note the number of denominations or different groups within the Baptist denomination. As you can see, these, and I listed some of the major groups, and this does not include them all, because you have, not only do you have North American Baptist, primitive Baptist, but you also have Southern primitive Baptist as well. But we tried to, without overloading the page and having a very small font, we thought we would give you a sense of how many groups are within the Baptist denomination. So even if we say we're focusing on a Baptist church, what type of Baptist church are we really talking and thinking about? Which comes to this point, that churches are as diverse as other communities. So one of the interesting things about faith-based research is that a significant segment of this work tends to highlight the importance of the pastor for the success or the efficacy of, or the acceptability of the intervention. What's interesting about that is that when considering the role of the pastor and the importance of the pastor or the power of the pastor, that it can vary considerably, just like the power of community leaders can vary within different communities. So I put up this cartoon. It's humorous. At the same time, it speaks to the diversity of the pastorate within churches. You can see on the back part of this cartoon, you'll see the Pastoral Search Committee. This is particularly important within the Baptist churches because you have this thing called local autonomy, which means that each church hires its own pastor. Now, you can have a number of different factors associated with that. However, this varies when you consider the African Methodist Episcopal churches that are more centralized, where leaders of congregations are decided by a central body, but when you consider the Baptist denominations, each of them will choose their own pastor. So the power or the influence of the pastorate can vary considerably within different churches or the faith community. So one of the things about churches that is particularly important is that churches have dimensions of sacredness within them, and churches are seen as sacred places, which means that they can be involved with sacred type of practices. So when considering faith-based versus faith-placed interventions, a number of articles that you will find focusing on faith-based interventions will refer to surface versus deep structure. And it was a highly influential article published by Ken Resnick and colleagues in 1999 that sort of gave one insight into how do we consider community organizations, what do we know about them? So those that are faith-placed have been categorized more as surface structure types of studies, where the materials, the messages are observable, but also that are linked to the characteristics of a target population. So in the recruitment materials, we'll refer to church, or they will have African Americans on them, but that's about as deep as it goes. In deep structure, there's more of an understanding of the culture, the history, the social environment, how people think about church or faith, how they think about their fellow church members, the importance of church, that gets that deep structure. And so faith-based institutions or faith-based interventions that have a deep structure element are considered to have more of an understanding of the population that they're trying to reach. There's a similar sentiment in the work that was published in 1997. It talked about the levels of involvement for faith organizations. And you could see it runs from level 1 to where church is a venue. Well, it's really easy to see that would be considered a faith-placed intervention, to level 4, where there's an integration of spiritual elements within the research context. Both of these conceptually oriented pieces of work have challenged researchers to think about how they should approach or how they develop their interventions, and the level and the depth to which they have an understanding of the group that they're trying to study. However, one question that I believe that does not get asked enough is, what does faith-based really mean? And it's important there are a number of questions that come out of that. First of all, what does faith-based mean to church and spiritual leaders? We'll see in faith-based research that there's the inclusion of things such as prayer or scripture, but how these elements are, or the sacredness of these elements, can vary by spiritual context. For example, prayer, there are two dimensions of prayer in the Christian church, in particular the Baptist church. There's personal prayer, which there's a great deal of sharing and that happens. And then there's congregational prayer, which is much more general. I put here prayer elements that when church leaders are trained to pray, they often are trained by using the acts. Think about adoration, confession, thanksgiving, and supplication, because in the scriptures, when Christ was teaching his disciples to pray, these elements were present in what we classify in the Baptist church as the Lord's Prayer. However, just saying that you have prayer, what does prayer mean to that church? The same thing with respect to scriptural considerations. Is it just the practice of reading scripture, or is it the study of scripture? These are important. So when someone says, oh, well, we read scripture and we pray, that does not necessarily mean that it's faith-based to church and spiritual leaders. It's important to ask that question. Another important question to consider is, how does the conceptual framework of the study line up with the theological foundation undergirding churches under consideration? Some churches have much more of an individual focus. Some will have more of a collective, focus on the collective. Some are more conservative. Some are progressive. And there's a continuum of theological thought. And where does the church that we're focusing on, where does that fit? It's important that whatever conceptual framework we bring to a study, it's important to consider how commensurable they are. That can have huge implications for the success or failure of a given intervention. How do study activities line up with congregational activities? Every congregation has a rhythm. Every congregation has a set of activities. Well, it's important to consider whether the study activities, it's best if they line up and become part of what the congregation does. However, it's important to think about that first. It's important to think about that. It's also to consider when the study activities will impede or conflict with congregational activities. And this is a question that I think that more attention is needed, is that can study activities alter how participants conceptualize church or faith? One of the things that's often overlooked in faith-based work is what is the level of faith within their participants? There is a considerable variation. However, are these things considered? Are they measured in some way? And if you take someone who may just attend church on Sundays and they get involved with the study, perhaps they get involved with other types of ministries because they have a broader view of what church means. It's important to understand how the study impacts the environment, as well as how the study affects individuals within it. So in considering all of these questions, what does faith-based mean? And if we decide that we want to engage in faith-based work, then it's important to understand that it's more than a partnership in working with churches. Covenants are important. A covenant, when you look at the formal definition, you'll see that it's a formal and serious agreement, or it's a promise. However, in the church, it speaks to, when there's a covenant agreement, it speaks to the establishment of a relationship or a bond. And it's a particular type of bond within churches. And that speaks to that the parties in a covenant, particularly when there's between two individuals or two groups, is that they're equal. And their bond is sealed by a vow that each would meet their respective obligations. This is particularly important when thinking about doing work in the church, is that understanding that it's more than a memorandum of understanding. A memorandum of understanding can be seen as a business type of practice. However, if we are looking to cultivate a deep structure understanding what a covenant agreement means. For example, in the Baptist church, there's a church covenant that's displayed at somewhere on the premises. Once you read it, you'll see that it speaks to the terms of the covenant between individuals who affiliate with the Baptist church. As a member of a Baptist church, you tacitly agree to abide by the terms of the church covenant. And so covenants are important, particularly in Christian Baptist churches. So one can consider, when working with churches or having the desire to work with the church, to consider what would it take to get to a covenant level of agreement with a particular church. One of the things that will help is having a historical understanding of the importance of churches and the roles of churches. These three works will give one an outstanding background of the importance of the church, the multiple roles that the church has played in the survival and of African Americans and African American communities. It can also speak to how leadership is developed among members of the church, but it also speaks to some of the challenges that churches have as well. Getting a historical context of what church means to congregations and also people who may not go to church. The church is a significant social institution, and getting a sense of how these churches matter. These books give one an excellent start. However, it's important to understand how the churches that you're targeting, what's their history? What has been their impact in the community that you're engaged with? One of the key things that I think that's important to consider in working with churches is seeking and finding commensurability. One of the things that often happens in intervention is that there's some form of behavior change or lifestyle change. Well, when you look at the role of the church, it's all about lifestyle or behavior change. Sermons are preached every Sunday about changing some aspect of behavior or changing one's life. So there's commonality between what interventionists might want to do, particularly those focusing on weight loss or weight maintenance in a given congregation. That's something that the pastors and leaders are attuned to. However, it's important to raise that. So I wanted to point out, raise this slide for you. This is a church that I attended some years ago. And you see that this is the Youth Character Football League. The pastor of the church was concerned about observations of kids being heavier in the congregation. And in fact, wanted to encourage their participation in sports, in particular football. Well, one of the things that was happening with a number of kids in that congregation was that they were too heavy to participate in Pop Warner football. So the pastor met with church leaders and came up with a Youth Character Football League where there was no weight limit. You'll see that on the slide, that there's no weight limit to it, that any child who wanted to participate on a football team could do so. This football league has been amazingly successful with its participation, so much so that the Pop Warner Leagues approached the pastor in Union Baptist Church to see if there could be a partnership, because there are so many other kids going away from Pop Warner football to go to the Youth Character Football League. Now, it's important to note that this particular league was more than just football. There was a focus on spirituality, a focus on what it means, focus on issues that were pertinent to kids and adolescents in terms of how to make good choices, how to stay away from violence, stay away from drugs, all of these types of things, as well as there was a strong academic focus. There were report card checks. So this football league was one that focused on the whole development of youth. And as you can see, there's a cheerleader there as well. So there was not only a focus on males, there was also a focus on the health of females as well, and coming up with activities for them that were related to the football league. So I'd like to close this presentation over the next few minutes to talk about an example of a project that's actually in the field called the Mighty Men Project. This project is led by a colleague and the director of the Center for Research on Men's Health at Vanderbilt, Dr. Derek Griffin. And it's important to see that Scripture lies at the very heart of even the title or the name of the study. That was important. That was an important signal. And I can tell you that from the churches that we've gotten involved with, it mattered to them. So prior to, though, the intervention, there was a great deal of time and effort devoted to becoming familiar with the churches in Atlanta, Georgia, because this was a new site for us. And Dr. Griffin used a technique that he called the fellowship breakfast. And that's a quarterly breakfast at a church that we're interested in working with, to where we invite men, regardless of age, to come out and participate in fellowship, but also some type of health education activity, as well as an informational session about the study, and to promote the study, let folks know that it was coming, and also hopefully get an opportunity to meet with church leaders. And as you can see, that a number of churches are participating in the fellowship breakfast. And what's one of the best things that we've seen in Atlanta is that the churches actually put on the fellowship breakfast themselves. So there's no cost to the center. They decided that that was something that they wanted to do because they were concerned about the health of men in their congregations. Now, this idea of the fellowship breakfast actually emerged from Dr. Griffin's work in Flint, Michigan, when he was at the University of Michigan. And this is an article that you can get access to that gives a great description of the fellowship breakfast and what's all entailed with it. So very quickly, if these slides allow us to transition, I want to present some of the things that we do in terms of how we approach churches, just to give you a sense of how we go about this. One of the things that's important for churches to know is exactly what you do, what you offer. That's really important for church leaders to know, because one of the worst things you can do in the church is overpromise and underdeliver. So you'll see, not only do we talk about what we do, we also talk about what we do not do. When you talk about health, oftentimes folks go straight to health care. So it was important for us to say that we don't give any type of medical treatment or advice, nor do we provide referrals for any type of treatment. We try to be very, very clear and upfront about that. Here's a slide that we use to describe the study. You see that we really try to keep it very simple. But it was also to really give some time to why this is called Mighty Men. It's not enough to use scripture, but to speak to how scripture or how faith influences our approach. And in this case, it speaks to where the name Mighty Men came from. And of course, there was a reference to David and the use of the term for his soldiers, the mighty men of God. We found that it's important to state why a faith-based approach is important to us. And here are some bullet points that we have raised. And I'd like to note the third bullet, which can be a discussion for another presentation, is that faith is an important source of motivation for men. Not only motivation for health, but motivation for other things as well, including relationships, how to navigate work situations. Faith is an important motivator, and there's some work that we have coming out where we have collected data from 300 or so African-American men, and we found that their identity is tied up into faith and some of their faith beliefs. This was important as well to really make it clear how this intervention or how this study can be a benefit to the church. It's important that to be upfront about what you're asking for, but also think about what you can give. So it's important that, it's particularly important to me that anytime we work with churches that we leave them a little bit better than we found them. And so bullet number one, the increase the capacity of health ministries, but also other ministries. One of the important things that is to consider is that not everybody who will participate in the Mighty Men intervention will be very, very active in the church. We don't make that assumption. So given that, it's likely that there may be non-members who attend. But the fact that they will spend a significant time in the church participating in this intervention, it could alter how they see the church and may encourage them to participate in church. So there are other benefits, but we thought it was important to highlight that Mighty Men, by their participation as a site, would be something that would be beneficial to the ministry and the growth of the ministry within their particular church. And here we lay out what we're asking for. As you can see, it's a 15-month commitment, so there's not helicoptering in, doing what we need to do, and leaving. It's important that we see it as a commitment. That we also to note that folks from the church will participate in the intervention, but it's also understanding that we'll also leave different types of information. Weight loss or health education will be a benefit to the church. So with that, this is a slide I'd like to end on, because in particular with churches, it's important that the means we use must be as pure as the ends we seek. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. And now we have a few minutes for questions.
So thank you very much for sharing your insights on this topic, Dr. Bruce. So we'll go ahead and open the floor to questions. Currently, I don't see any listed in the Q&A section, but if you do have questions, we will take those questions now. And while we wait for responses, I guess I have a question. On one of those latter slides where you were describing mighty men, you talked about faith as an important source of motivation for men. And
yes,
in terms of thinking about interventions, thinking about any type of research that specifically focuses on African Americans, on the Black community, I know men, it's always difficult to recruit men, to oftentimes bring them into interventions, especially when the focus may be specifically on that population. So in terms of thinking about that from a recruitment perspective, as it relates to faith-based interventions, what do you think are some of the things that may potentially be facilitated by the setting and the context of the environment in terms of being able to bring men into studies, being able to recruit them in a faith-based intervention as opposed to a non-secular intervention?
Sure. One of the key things that happens with men in church is that church can be a source of fellowship for men. And so with the fellowship breakfast, it's a key tool to bring men together. And so by bringing men together, they see that the intervention is also an opportune time that they can get together with other men. So within faith-based settings, there's a key focus on fellowship. And many churches will have men's ministry. And in my experience, the men's ministries tend to focus on fellowship. So there's a group element to opportunities for men to come together. And so in a faith-based setting, it's much more collective and collaborative than perhaps other secular settings that can be much more individualistic. So I think that faith-based settings, just because you have concepts such as family, we talk about brothers and sisters, using those terms to refer to one another. It creates a spirit of collectiveness, and one can draw from that. And that's why it's important to get a sense of the churches that you want to work with, see how you can plug into something that they're already doing. That's also particularly important. Sometimes creating a new thing can be disruptive, but one of the best ways I think, to recruit is to see what you can become a part of, see what you can see what you can add to some of the programming that's already there. And with men in particular, I also want to speak to the idea that there are men in churches. Churches tend to be led by men. So if you're working with the church where you have a number of men in leadership, you may want to think about how you appeal to leaders in church. So having something on leadership would be important to note as well.
Yeah, I really think it speaks to what you've been describing in terms of that contrast between faith-placed and faith-based,
Yes.
and really integrating what it is that you would like to do in that faith-based setting through
Yes.
that process of really tailoring it to what's happening within the church.
Yes.
I have another question. So that Mighty Men program seems to be popular. This particular question asks, as it relates to the role that women played in that particular program, if any at all, to support that program.
Great question. Actually, there is a role. One of the things that we often do is that it's part of the recruitment is getting a sense of who their significant others are, and we think broadly, whether it's a wife or a girlfriend, but also a daughter. We find that for African American men, it's important to have some sort of relationship to their significant others to get a sense of more of the context of the individuals. We found that men can be tough nuts to crack initially in terms of talking, but when you talk about their family and have, if you tailor your sessions to focus on family and those types of things, we find that they're much more receptive. So women play a significant role in recruitment, but also in some of the session development.
If you have any questions, you can please offer them up through the Q&A, or you can add them to the chat window. So we do have a little time left, so I'm not sure if anyone else is interested in any of the work that Dr. Bruce has presented this afternoon. I have another question, and I'm really interested in the earlier part of your presentation, where you were actually really setting the stage in terms of the types of interventions that potentially occur in faith settings. And I was really attuned to the comment that you made about, can study activities alter how participants conceptualize church or faith? And it made me think about, kind of spiritual locus of control, and how people, put their faith, rather, for lack of a better word, into God in terms of helping them deal with the issues that they face in everyday lives, or some of the challenges that they may face, or even as it brings them to the intervention in terms of what the expectations are.
Right.
I'm thinking about that particularly in the context of how interventions are developed and implemented in faith-based settings, thinking about, that consideration of, that spiritual locus of control, and what would potentially compel people to be more involved, to be more vested in an intervention.
Great. That's a great question. I think that's where it's important to get a sense of the church culture and get a sense of the theology that's present, or the theological context. Because in some churches, the idea of faith speaks to an opportunity to commune and co-create with God. So what I mean by that is this, that if you see God as distant, then one may refrain from actual participation because, well, my health is in God's hands, right? But if you say that God is around and that God has created an opportunity for us to have better health, and that's reinforced through the preaching and teaching that's in the church, one may have more participation, and they may adopt some of the recommendations that may come, because they see that the presence of mighty men can be seen as a blessing. And so if it's seen that way, folks are more likely to embrace it. But it all depends in that case. I mean, it's a simple example. It can be based on the theology that's being preached and taught. And so it's important that anybody thinking about working with churches to get a sense of what's being preached there, what's being taught there, what is their view of God there, what's their view of one's relationship with God. And you can get a sense of that from just attending service, attending a Bible study. You don't have to do it for a long time, but it's important to do because that can give one a sense of how folks will view you as part of the church. Because one of the things that happens is that once you begin working with churches, you become part of it. Whether you want to believe that or not, you actually become part of what they do. If you're in a church for 15 months, you're part of what they do. So it's important to understand how that's seen and how that will be conceptualized by members of that congregation.
And it really is something to say that it's more you're really creating a partnership. You're creating a relationship that will potentially be long-standing, I'm
Yes.
assuming it speaks volumes to the perspective of the researchers, the people who are coming into the church to do that type of work. That they're really seen as someone who is becoming integral to the church, and not necessarily someone who's just there to kind of.
Yes, that is correct. That is absolutely correct. In the church, we often talk about that's the difference between someone who just attends on Sundays versus someone who begins to roll up their sleeves and work in the church. It's a big difference.
So we have a few short moments left, and I think we've answered many of the questions that have been presented. I'm not sure if you have any parting words about those who are interested in developing faith-based interventions as a means to achieving health-related outcomes in the Black community. But if you'd like to share anything, this would be a great opportunity to do so.
Sure. My parting thought is that understanding that churches are communities in and of themselves, and so one would have to approach each church, if you have a multi-church intervention, understanding that you're dealing with multiple communities and having that focus. So while community-partnered or community-based participatory research can give one some insights into that in terms of how you approach, how much time it takes to get to know churches and folks in the church, but understanding that churches are communities. They may be small communities, but if you look at a church as a community and treat it as such, you can give them the consideration that's needed to have efficacious interventions within.
Fantastic, fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Bruce. And I'd like to thank you all on the lines for participating in the Solutions to Diabetes in Black Americans webinar, When Theory Meets Theology, Examining Assumptions of Faith-Based and Faith-Placed Interventions. We will email a follow-up evaluation survey and share a video of this webinar shortly. So for those who weren't able to attend today, they'll actually be able to access this great presentation this afternoon. So we thank you all. Thank you, Dr. Bruce.
Thank you. Thank you for your attention and your time. Thank you so much. Have a great day, everybody.
Bye-bye, everyone.